online, and we want to make the most of our time together. So welcome to this seminar in the Global Conversations series presented by the International Consortium of Environmental History Organisations. It's really lovely to be with you here tonight or this morning or the afternoon, wherever you might be. There's familiar faces in the crowd as well, but for those of you who don't know me, I am Ruth Morgan from the Australian National University, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight two incredible historians, Professor Emerita Grace Karskens from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and Dr. Margaret Cook from the University of the Sunshine Coast, north of Brisbane. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which I live and work, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations peoples joining us today. You might like to take the opportunity to use the chat function to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that you're zooming in from. Now, if you haven't joined one of our global conversations so far, over the past 18 months, we've been really fortunate to hear from historians and social scientists whose work has helped to shape the field of environmental history, particularly bringing to bear insights from the global south, as well as cognate fields and Indigenous perspectives. In today's event, we're talking with Grace and Margaret about their work on the flood histories of Australia, and to look at how these histories shed light on both the past, present, and future. Many of you will know both of our speakers, but I will introduce them. Grace is the author of People of the River, Lost Worlds of Early Australia, which has won a slew of awards for its truly remarkable insights into the deep human and environmental histories of the Hawkesbury Nepean River, or Dajarubin, as it's long been known to its First Nations peoples, the Darug and Duckinyung peoples. In this book, she brings to bear her training as an archaeologist and historian to shed new light on the material and social worlds of the early decades of Britain's penal colony of New South Wales. Margaret is the author of A River with a City Problem, A History of Brisbane Floods, which has been an extremely timely book for all kinds of reasons, not least as southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales have again grappled with very heavy rainfall and flooding just this year. In this book, Margaret weaves together the human and environmental histories of Queensland's capital city, built precariously on the Brisbane River's floodplain on the lands of the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples. So thank you for joining me tonight, Margaret and Grace.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth.
Yes.
Thanks for organising it.
My pleasure, and thank you for making the time. So I think it would be very handy for you both to introduce your rivers to us, because I suspect not everyone will be as intimately acquainted with them as you two have become. Perhaps you could start us off, Grace.
Sure, I will do that. I'm going to introduce everybody to Dajarubin, the Hawkesbury Nepean River. It's got a lot of names, this river. So the Hawkesbury Nepean is the river that flows all the way around the Cumberland Plain. I'll just indicate that here. And much of the Cumberland Plain is just covered with suburbs because Sydney is this huge, sprawling, mostly low-density city. So the river comes around here. But it actually rises in the Southern Highlands to the southwest, near Goulburn. It flows through this very rugged country. Am I squeaking?
Not really.
Is that me? Anyway, there's a mouse in my machine.
Oh, I see where it might be coming from.
Anyway, it roars down from the highlands through the gorges and then comes out into the flatlands, the beautiful alluvial areas, which I have in this map, which is the part that the book is actually about. And at Wiseman's Ferry or Woolomarang, it turns to the east and makes a break for the coast and flows into the ocean at Broken Bay, just here. But I just want to draw your attention to this U-turn here, this hairpin bend on the river. That's at a place called Sackville or Drumballoa. Now, this is a very weird river because it begins in the highlands at Goulburn, as I said, but here at Sackville or Drumballoa, it actually flows back into the highlands. It flows uphill and flows through this sandstone labyrinth here, winding back and forth till it hits the cliffs at Wiseman's Ferry and, as I said, makes a break for the sea. This loop here is what the geomorphologists call the Nick Point. And that is why this entire river floods, because it's like water trying to get out of a bathtub. It can't get through this point here. And so the whole valley backs up. And that's why the Hawkesbury, Nepean, Drubbin floods so badly. So I might hand over to stop share. There we go. I'll hand it over to Margaret now. We'll hear about the Brisbane River.
Right. So here's the Brisbane River, and it's known as Meanjin by the Yagara and Turrbal people. Now, the Brisbane River starts in the headwaters up now near Mount Stanley that you can see there, and it goes all the way down to Moreton Bay. It's a length of 309 kilometres, but it's such a meandering river that it's actually really hard to even work out how long it is when you're travelling it. As I said, it's meandering and it flows through the capital of Brisbane. So it's in Queensland, which is in towards the north of Australia. And so it's an urban river that's running through the cities of Ipswich and Brisbane in particular. It has a very large catchment of 13,500 square kilometres, and it's fed by a number of rivers. So it's got the Upper Brisbane, the Stanley and the Bremer River in Ipswich. And it's also got 22 creeks. And the interesting part of this is that two of those creeks in particular, the Lockyer Creek and Oxley Creek, are very large creeks. And all of these creeks can actually flood in their own right, or they can work together and make this a particularly flood-prone area. It's a subtropical river, so it means that in some years it can be in drought. We've had years where it's had zero flow rate, and we've had other years where it's had thousands of cubic metres going through the system. So it just depends. So they say Australian rivers are very variable in terms of their flow rate. I think this one could be up there in the top rivers in terms of its variability. It's a really interesting river to try and forecast floods because of all of those factors. There's another couple of things that are worth mentioning about the Brisbane River, and they're marked on this map. So we have Somerset Dam, which was built in the 50s, and we had Wivenhoe Dam, which was built in the 1980s, which means it's a regulated river. But the other part that's interesting is those two dams are both dual purpose dams. So they do flood water supply and flood mitigation. So that's quite unusual for dams. And it's really important to know that when we're talking about floods in Brisbane, because how we manage those dams is part of the story of how people understand floods in this part of the world. And the one other thing that we really need to know when we're looking at the Brisbane River is that only half of it is regulated. And so there's this big myth that Brisbane River is regulated and that floods can be prevented. But when you've got half the river system that's not subject to those dams, anything downstream is unregulated and uncontrollable. And those dams actually provide 90% of Brisbane's water as well, water supply. So those dams play a very important part in the flood and water supply story of Brisbane. So thank you, that's my river.
Wow. Okay, thank you so much. I think it's really useful just to get a bit of a sense of place, a sense of scale. A river is not just a river, as we know, and I think getting a little bit of insight into how these work is really valuable and sets the scene for us and our discussion. So, Grace, you keep coming back to this time and place. You've got a bit of a bug when it comes to this part of the country and its history, and I wonder what is it about the Dairubin, the Hawkesbury Nepean that keeps pulling you back in?
Yeah, and it hasn't finished with me yet, you know.
I know.
After all these years, but that's okay. I actually grew up in Western Sydney, but I wasn't really aware of the river growing up. There were flood stories in my family from the northern rivers, ironically, where I've just been, also slightly uncanny. But when I did my great monstrous MA thesis on the convict-built Great North Road, which was built in the 1820s and 30s, we had to go and do field work at Wiseman's Ferry, because that's the road went across there at the ferry. And I was absolutely knocked out by the landscape. There was something about it. I mean, I'm not religious or I wasn't religious, or I'm still not really, but there was something about those gaunt, gigantic yellow cliffs that I just thought sensed something anyway. And then when I was working as a consultant, a number of the projects I worked on were there. And then I think because I got interested in the Penrith Lake scheme, which is a gravel mining a giant gravel pit that's going to be turned into lakes. And I was quite fascinated by that because I couldn't understand how they'd been allowed to do it, for starters. But then, you know, I wondered, what's the true cost of this great destructive development? You could ask that about any mining project, I guess, because they spent bazillions on, you know, environmental impact studies, but didn't actually get to what was actually lost. And to find out what's lost, you have to ask, who lived here before? And that sounds like a simple question, but it's really not a simple question. And that's really what kicked off this latest, you know, research phase, which took 10 years to really tell that story of Dirabin, its Aboriginal people, and it's the settlers who invaded from 1795. Yeah, but as I said, it's not done with me yet.
Well, that's good to know, because it means we'll get to hear some more stories about about the river and its people. Really interesting. So, I mean, we've heard a little bit from Grace there about how she got drawn into her river. How about you, Margaret?
Well, I lived through the 2011 floods, and the whole context of the conversation in the media and the general public was this annoying word, unprecedented. I kept hearing it. You know, it was the 5th biggest flood we'd had on record. So there certainly was an unprecedented. And I thought, I'd like to change that conversation a little bit because it was annoying me as an historian. I'd lived through earlier floods myself, so I knew it wasn't true. So I started looking around to see who'd written about floods. And not a lot. There were little bits of these pieces, as always, but no one had really put the story together. So that was my PhD challenge, to put the story together. And the reason I wanted to do that is, the other reason is, I'd trained as a social historian, and then I'd worked in cultural heritage for a long time. So I was interested in people and place. So for me, that's the appeal of environmental history, that you can look at that dynamic. But even more so, I think floods are that moment of crisis or disaster. And in your own personal moments of crisis, you can reveal your own strengths and weaknesses. You know, you discover you've got an inner strength that you didn't know. But the same applies to society as a whole. In those moments of disaster, it reveals a lot about a society. It shows who's vulnerable, who's in power, decisions we've made in the past that affect how we've got to today. So I think they're a great moment of shining a spotlight on society to ask some really interesting questions. And floods can actually just be the device that allow you to ask some of those things and really look at a city that I thought I was very familiar with, having grown up here, but actually to start interrogating it in a different way through a different lens was the challenge for me, and what floods can do. I think it's my attraction for looking at the river.
It's home. It makes sense.
Yeah.
I love that thing that you just said there, Margaret, that this is a familiar landscape and you see it in a whole different light.
Yeah.
And you have a wonderful quote from the Indigenous artist Tex Sculthorpe about that. What is it? The water shows where. No, wait a minute. The water shows
where the floods
the country.
Yeah, country.
Just fabulous. It's so true.
And it's particularly because Brisbane's meanders so much. It's not so obvious. Sometimes it's really obvious because you can see the river, but a lot of our parts of the river, the bits that flood are quite away from the river. So you really can't predict the floodplain. So it's quite shocking. And so people are genuinely surprised in some cases.
Yeah, that's such an important point.
And that's a role for history there. I think it's particularly when you have new generations or people moving into an area. And for those of us who aren't familiar with this part of Australia, it's a place of enormous population growth in recent times. So there's a lot of people for whom that kind of flooding might be unprecedented, but it isn't for that place. And I think so much of what you're doing, Margaret, is also looking at the kinds of stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah, and the myths we tell ourselves.
That's right.
Yeah.
To justify, keeping on living in this rather.
And you're right, Ruth, Southeast Queensland's growing so rapidly that even as many of you may know, we've had floods this year. So it's only 10 or so years since the last one. But a lot of people have moved to that area in that time. So collective memory erodes very, very fast. And so I think the role of historians is to keep those stories and memories alive, so that, because the politicians and the real estate agents don't necessarily want people to keep those stories alive. So we need to.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think what we're seeing emerge from your work, the way you sort of see your rivers as part of a bigger system, is pointing to, I suppose, a bioregional approach to understanding rivers and the communities and histories that are all entangled with each other, which we might see as almost a bioregional history. And I wonder if you see a kind of Australian approach emerging in your writing, whether that's about place and settler colonialism or other ways of framing this kind of scales at which you're working at.
Yeah. You want me to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, I agree. I think the bioregional approach makes total sense for environmental history and flood history, of course. But I think on a larger scale, it makes sense for history more generally, because there's a kind of a geographic and ecological logic to bioregions, right? So there's certain patterns and rules that affect Aboriginal people and settlers alike. What I really like about it is you can't be lazy in regional history. You can't, use generalizations, or you have to ground truth everything. And it's so important, because that's how you actually get to the real stories of real people and how they respond to the river, the floods, the mountains, whatever you're looking at. You can't say just, oh, well, they hated trees. Or they hated the monotonous bush. If I see that again, I'm going to scream. The bioregion is where you get to test those generalizations that are so easily tossed around all the time. And I also love it because it's where you get to slow history down, be an ethnographer, find out why people are doing things. What do they think of the river? Not us, not what we think, but what did they think of those floodplains and that soil and those rivers? And I mean settlers and Aboriginal people as well. Did you want to respond there, Margaret, before we go on?
I do.
Whether it's Australian or not?
I think it's really important that we look at it as a bioregion, because interestingly, in terms of management, particularly, they don't. I mean, in Brisbane, it covers several local government areas, and they look at me a little bit strangely when I say rivers don't really respect local government boundaries. But they don't. That's funnily enough. So it's really important to think about, what happens upstream in the Lockyer Valley every time we clear another tree or we plant, and remove the topsoil. That's going to end up in the Brisbane River system. And all of these decisions we make every time we build something or so affects the whole catchment. And so I actually think there's that disconnect that people in Brisbane City don't really understand how big this river is, and that the floods actually don't start in the city. So I think it's really, really important that we actually understand our geography a lot better, as well as the biorhythms of the river, and the way we live and work with this river is actually really important, and it's changed its history and will change our future. So, I think it's the settler colonial decisions that have been made that actually frame that history. So we need to respect that there's a much longer history that doesn't actually involve humans even. It's a geological history as well.
Oh, can I just add there, you're right. I mean, and practically speaking, the bioregion is where you can do really good multidisciplinary integrated history, because you do need to read all the geology and all the ecology and all the river geomorphology and the soil science and on, which is how I got to understand Hawkesbury, Nepean, Jarubin. But it's actually practical. You can actually do it at this level, and you must do it, otherwise you won't understand. I mean, there's no point looking at the bioregion. So yeah, it's practically speaking, for research, it's a great unit of study, a scale to look at.
And it adds so many layers of richness, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, that's the other thing too. Apart from increasing your own knowledge, it just adds that complexity of the issues you're looking at. And they all are interconnected and interrelated. You can't take one out without looking at another.
That's right. And I didn't mention, of course, history and archaeology, and of course, traditional knowledge and dreaming stories. I mean, they all interact, they all intercept.
Yeah, and I think what you see at that scale is that the sorts of divisions, I mean, you've mentioned local government areas, Margaret, but how we see cities and country areas, and that just doesn't make sense when you're thinking about a watershed or a bioregion, when you can see all these connections. And at that level, you're also able to see different kinds of processes of causation and contingency that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily be aware of. But to this question of an Australian approach to environmental history, is there something to that here, do you think?
I think so. And I want to say here that I don't think we should be, I don't know, just my country good or bad or anything like that. But, you know, so I've been inspired right through my career by people like Don Worcester saying things like, once a natural feature disappears, it disappears from public memory, which is exactly what Margaret's talking about. That was totally inspiring for me. If you can't see it, then it sort of disappears out of memory, which is worrying. Oh, or William Cronin's hybrid landscapes, that helps so much with looking at a gravel quarry and fake lakes, you know. So the literature worldwide is really important, of course. But on the other hand, I do think there is a distinctive Australian environmental history, and there's a great body of now building up tradition of a style of writing, which I think is important and wonderful. Firstly, I think because the geographies and the ecologies in Australia are so unique and different, and you can't just say, oh, let's just use the template from European rivers, because as Margaret and I and everybody else who's ever studied an Australian river knows, it doesn't fit. They're very distinctive. They behave in different ways. But there's also the uniqueness of the human history reaching back 60,000 years, and historians' great task now is to weave that long, deep history with the more recent history of the last 230 years. And that certainly does make it distinctive.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really echo what Grace has said, and that, yes, there are these great traditions that we borrow, but we now have our own unique Australian traditions, and I certainly have benefited from the work of Grace and Ruth and Emily O'Gorman and Tom Griffiths, who've all written about rivers and flooding and disasters that have definitely shaped my thinking and the way we look at it. And I think Australia's a different country too, because water is so important and so rare and so precious. And I think we need to recognise that we live in such a dry continent, that I think that has to also shape the way we look at our environmental history as well. That Cathcart talks about the importance of water and so on, and he's talked about that for a long time. But I think if you I remember reading very early in my research that, you know, Australian history you can't take water out of that. And I think when you start putting water in as your central thinking, it really changes the questions you ask. So I think that does shape Australian history as well, that important of our climate, our elements that we live with. It's so different, as well as you say, our Aboriginal history and so on, that must be recognised. We're living in just a different environment that's so different from the colonial settlers' world that they came from.
Yeah. I'd add fire to that, Margaret.
Yes.
Can't write it without fire history either.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And an earthquake in Brisbane today, who knew?
Oh,
so
what?
You know, we're even starting to expand on our disasters.
Oh no.
Oh gosh. I missed that memo. Wow.
Yeah.
That's the next book, Margaret.
Yeah, the next one. And cyclones is yet to be really covered a lot too. So, you know, disasters are a bigger part of Australia's environmental history as well.
And something that, you know, I think Margaret's really done a great job actually in kind of marshalling a lot of you know, sophisticated approaches, I think, to disaster history, along with Scott McKinnon. They've edited a collection on various disasters that have afflicted settler Australia, and reminds us, I suppose, that our place on this continent is very vulnerable, I think, and our way of life is always tenuous, despite, you know, what we might think. And I think the sorts of comments you've both made about how you see the history that you do as ethnographic, as fine-grained, as reminding people of the places that they live in. That's all very, that's not necessarily the traditional way of doing history for a lot of people. And I would love to learn a bit more about your processes, how you write these kinds of histories. Grace, I know you work with a lot of Indigenous communities to recover lost worlds. Margaret, you talk with a lot of policymakers, engineers, dealing with a lot of what some people would say would be rather dry. I know it's not for those of us who are into water, but I wondered about the kinds of sources, the techniques, the ethics, the challenges, how you bring this regional history to life.
Margaret, would you like to?
I could do that one first.
Yeah,
please.
My background was as a public historian, so I suppose collaboration is just what I've always done. I've worked with archaeologists, engineers, architects, town planners, surveyors, and so on. So I think that was a sort of a natural inclination to do that, and to have a sort of public outreach approach to my history as part of it. And in part, that's a respect for the knowledges that they can bring, and Aboriginal knowledge is a part of that as well, obviously. It's also recognition that what I don't know. I know lots. I know I need to learn lots, and other people have that knowledge that I need. And also when I'm writing about floods and so on, I have to delve into a lot of science and a lot of geology and a lot of geomorphology. And, I did very little science at school. And so I need all the help I can get. And so when I'm reading these flow rate charts and hydrologist diagrams and so on, I needed help. And so I was very fortunate that I made a lot of friends amongst the engineering and hydrology community, because to me it was really, really important that I tried to get the science right. Because whilst I am comfortable in the archives, in the history world, and with oral history, I knew that if I didn't get the science right, lots of people wouldn't read it. And so the history would be discredited because the science was bad. So for me, it was really important to read those scientific documents and to do the best I could do to understand them. And so that naturally took me into a whole lot of areas that were not my natural place to play. But I think it made it a richer history because I had to learn those things. You can't talk cubics and cubic meters and so on unless you've got some idea of what you're talking about. Yeah. So would you agree, Grace,
Absolutely.
that you need to
every word. No, that's true. And I, have to acknowledge all the soil scientists and the river people and all the botanists, and they were just magnificent, and because you are out of your comfort zone, and I think that's important. I find it scary but also exciting because you're learning, and I do think that historians are the ones who can step back and actually see across. Did you find that I found a lot of scientists are basically working in their own areas and not actually talking to each other all that much? It might be different for Brisbane River, but there's so much research on Hawkesbury Nepean, but it's all in different categories. So today scientific knowledge is often shattered in millions of different places. So I think it's partly the historian's job to understand it, get on top of it, translate it for our readers, but also bring it together, back together. So that's another thing you've done with your work, and I hope that I've done with mine. And can I just say, I started out as a public historian too. And again, it's just shaped my entire career, all my writing, and also my big aim of getting good history out to people rather than leaving it in the institution. Not that that's anything wrong with that, but what's the point of doing all this research if it doesn't feed back into public knowledge, and possibly even might, encourage us to remember that there are floods and they will come back, just as you say.
And sometimes it's just a matter of being the conduit for some of that information. I mean, a lot of these, I've gone to a lot of talks now to engineering communities or water communities and so on, and I'm not telling them anything they don't know, but it's a different way of them. And they all say to me, we haven't thought about it that way, or we haven't put it together, or we can't communicate the same way. And it's that narrative skill that we are trained that they don't necessarily have. So I think that's that lovely moment where you get the disciplines working together, where they can feed me the science and the knowledge I need, but I can massage it into a story or whatever we do that makes it accessible.
Yeah, but as you say, you have to be on top of it before you can write confidently.
Tell you what. and
remember reading the geology and I had to create a glossary because I didn't know what they were talking about.
My husband's a geologist, and I would have come to him many times and say, what is this?
Yep.
Oh dear. But I think something that comes out of what both of you are talking about there, it is that ground truthing that Grace mentioned earlier. If the science doesn't actually work, if you don't translate it correctly, it does sort of somewhat, maybe not undermine, but it does make your history a bit funny if it doesn't hold together in its sort of ecological sense in terms of explanation. But I think there's you've both mentioned your public history backgrounds and your commitment to collaboration and getting good history out there. I think there are other matters at stake though, and for both of you, Margaret, in terms of reminding people, particularly in Brisbane and Southeast Queensland, that they live in a very precarious area, and Grace, your collaborative efforts are actually contributing a lot to cultural regeneration, I imagine, in the area. I wondered if you could both shed a bit more light on I suppose, the ongoing work that your work is contributing to.
Sure, I could easily speak to that. I guess one of the big, just to find down that idea of bringing good history out to the community, I've always been interested in fostering a historical sense of place for people, and so I try to recreate it in the past, but also have references to the present so that people know where I'm actually talking about, because a lot of history is a bit unplaced. It's not anchored to anything, but everything happens in a place. So, and especially again bioregional history, it's all about place. But the work that I have done with traditional owners has been one of the best things I've ever worked on, because we've been decolonizing history for the last 50 years, but we also have to decolonize our historical methods, and working equally with traditional owners and really according to what they want, their aims and aspirations, rather than what the university's telling you to do, is really important. So it has to be, I just learnt a lot about what that actually means in practice. And I do think it has contributed a lot to cultural regeneration in the Hawkesbury, because while there is traditional knowledge, and I was lucky and honoured to have that shared with me, there's a lot that's been lost too. Language, there aren't speakers now in that region, which is just terrible. I mean, that really haunted me as I was writing the book. What are the names of these places? Look at all this culture that's where is it? So when I found the Reverend McGarvey's long lost list of 178 place names, I did nearly fall off my chair, and went into this collaborative project, and we've managed to put 90 of those back on the map. And we've been able to, with the help of linguists and geographers and bushwalkers, we've been able to also understand what those names mean, or many of them. It's like unlocking a lost geography of Darug and Darkinjung landscapes country in the late 1820s, and we've been able to map that too. So it's just been wonderful, and it will lead to more cultural awakening, I think.
And I think for obviously for the local Indigenous peoples, but also for other people who enjoy that place and will certainly I think be all the more enriched in terms of their experiences.
Oh, that's right. I think that the main point was to try and restore the names and all the knowledge that was around those names, now that we have that. But from the non-Aboriginal people I speak to, there's a massive hunger out there to understand country better. A lot of people say to me, well, I always wanted to know more, but I just, like, what do we know? So I think it meets that hunger as well.
That connection to place, that sense of place.
Connection to place.
What about you, Margaret?
Yeah, well, if I add to that, I mean, what Grace does so beautifully is describe place. I mean, when words are so evocative, you can get there so beautifully. And your work in reconstructing language is phenomenal, because I have spent years trying to find the name of the Bremer River. I mean, it sounds, I last week got one possibility, but the loss of cultural knowledge is so upsetting. It's really heartbreaking. But also in non-Indigenous cultures, the connection with country is really poor. And one of the things that I have been able to do is, I showed you the map before. Brisbane River is very, very long. It takes a long time for that water to come down the headwaters, and yet from the headwaters, and yet people sit and wait. In 2 days you can pack up a house, and that's how long it takes. And yet people sit and wait because they've got this myth that Brisbane won't flood. And so if I do nothing else other than get a couple of people out of the floodwater each time, maybe that's a good thing. And we're not going to evacuate the floodplain. I'm not suggesting that we'll ever do that. But if people are just a little bit more flood aware, they can make different decisions, and they can pack up and they can get out. And it is actually the difference of saving a life or not, because people drown in floods. Yeah. So if I can sort of make people a little bit more aware when they're buying a house, or when they're choosing what building materials they use, that can only be a good thing. And I'm not saying historians have that role to shape policy or predict the future or anything like that, but I think we can have a role by showing that some of the decisions we've made in the past may not have been the smartest ones, and that there are alternatives that we can live with. And floods will come again. Climate change suggests that floods will come more frequently and will be larger. And so it's sort of beholden on us to start understanding our environment more, I would suggest. And that's something that I think we can both do.
Yep. So. Absolutely agree.
A question that occurred to me, and this is a question without notice, so do forgive me, but I think you're both very well placed to answer it. And I know, Grace, you've written about this before, and Margaret, I suspect it's come up a lot in your media interviews over the past 6 months, is this question of relocation. Why do people live on these floodplains? Why do they live in the face of disaster? And I wondered whether you could glean some insights and share them with us from the kinds of work you've done. I know even from the beginning, Grace, of the New South Wales colony, that was a question of why on earth people would choose to live in this dangerous area. And Margaret, obviously, Brisbane has remained where it is, but of course Lismore in northern New South Wales has recently been, again, a topic of conversation about its future. And I wondered what you make of that.
Yeah. Yes, you often even see recently, I don't know if they're scientists or reporters or what, journalists, but they say, the early settlers are very stupid. They're very stupid. They're so stupid that they moved onto the floodplain. Well, actually, that people I was studying, because like Margaret, I want to understand floods in terms of the figures, the geomorphology and all that stuff, geology. But I also want to understand what I call flood-mindedness, and I think we both do that. And it's really interesting to compare these two flood-mindednesses at either end of the 200 years or whatever it is between these two floods, or the sets of floods that I looked at. In fact, the early settlers, they knew there were floods. They could see the debris high in the trees, 30 meters up, and they still moved onto that land. Lots of reasons. One, they're convicts, ex-convicts. They want their own land. They want to be free of surveillance. They know that this is rich soil and it's going to pay back. And they do stay on their farms on the lowlands. So the lowlands are the worst, but then the next parts of the floodplains also get inundated. So there's 37 floods in 25 years, and 9 of those were the monster floods that washed everything away. It was just terrible. And yet they don't move. Even, Governor Macquarie says, you guys have to get off there. I'm ordering you to get off your farms and live on high land. They were going to keep the farms, but they had to live on high land. They wouldn't go. They would not budge. And so what I discovered was that when you look carefully at how people respond, yes, they suffer terribly in these disasters. Everything, they often lose everything, all their stock, their homes, well, bark huts that really are. But they are quite positive about floods because the flood leaves behind a rich layer of silt, very rich. And in their world, which is very different to the world of now and to the people Margaret's writing about, in their world, the river's given them something to make up for what it took away. And the next few years after the flood are going to be bumper crops. And so everything will be righted again. So it's a different worldview where you can't control the flood. There's no one thinks about being superior to nature or, you know, in that sense of controlling a river. There's no ideas of dams or weirs or anything like that. This is the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It's more about recognizing the signs of floods, which they all skedaddle really quickly as soon as they can. They move their valuables to higher land. But then when the flood leaves behind this silt, things even out, you know, they lose some, they win some. They're gamblers, basically. And it's such a different attitude to the modern world. And it's a different landform. It's a different everything to what Margaret's writing about on the Brisbane River in 2011.
Except I totally agree with you that there's gambling involved. It's that risk.
Yeah, that's true.
It's that risk. People will take that risk. I mean, I talked to people who said that, you know, they could wait another 50 years, so they'll take that chance. And
wow.
You know, so that's one thing. And you know, Scott McKinnon and I have done work on memory and flood memory, and people have really bad memories.
They do.
So they forget really quickly about the flood history. I mean, it was interesting even in 2022 that people had sort of forgotten parts of 2011, and that's quite recent history. So what do they do with the 1893 floods? I mean, that's not even on the radar, and yet those were huge floods. So I think that's one of the things. The other thing in Brisbane, that flood up in the upper area, it's fertile, but in Brisbane it's two things. It's aesthetically pleasing, so it's very valuable land. So it's a status symbol to live near the river, or it's in the low-lying land, which is cheap, and that's where the vulnerable people get to live.
That's always a way, isn't it? Always a way.
Yeah, and so they can't afford to move. So when you say, let's move the city, the people who are most able to move don't want to because they've got the means to rebuild and stay there. And the people who really need to move can't afford to. So that's the risk part, and that's the social responsibility and those issues of vulnerability that we need to address. But that's why people don't stay. And there's also a funny thing that's almost like a Superman tendency that psychologists have told me, that if you survive one flood, you think you're invincible, so you'll survive the next one, which is, I think, crazy. But my uncle said he'd survived 2 floods, and then he moved and he said, I discovered I was a 2-flood man. And he just go, what? But I think, you know, it's interesting that people think they can stay, and and people have an attachment to place which is real. They love living in their little part of the world, and so they don't want to move, or they can't move. I think those are real problems.
Yeah. Agreed.
And
also, Margaret, you write a lot about putting faith in science. You know, the dams are supposed to protect you. Yeah. Insurance will pay off. I mean, that's so different to 200 years ago. There was none of that. You know?
Yeah. And the myth
was that the insurance was that the silt would come and you'd have a bumper crop, basically.
Yeah. Whereas now it's where we have dams, we'll be right, we'll put our faith in science and technology.
Yep.
And there's a myth that, you know, we know that dams mean mitigation, but for lots of people they hear prevention. Not helped by the fact that that's what they're told. Yep. So it's a whole world view that's really, really different. That is, governments will protect them, they'll bail them out, the insurance will help. So it takes away that individual responsibility a little bit as well, which I think your settlers had that much better idea of. Absolutely. Responsibility.
Yeah, they did. Mind you, Governor Macquarie lost his battle to get them to move, and he thought they were bewitched by the river. Wow. I agree with him. They were.
I think they still are to some extent.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yep.
No, and I think that this is a conversation about relocation, that it's, you know, coming up increasingly around climate change in terms of adaptation, and not often, I think, in the Australian context, usually in terms of small islands and places considered especially vulnerable, but why not Australia? And I think we've seen with these intense events, whether they're bushfires, floods, droughts, how to actually live in these areas.
And in Brisbane, in Grantham, which is, you know, near Lockyer Creek, they moved the town of Grantham after 2011, and this time around the only 2 buildings that flooded were the 2 that didn't move. So, you know, it's and they didn't move because one is a petrol station that wanted to stay on the highway. And the other one was a shop that couldn't get the money to move, a house that couldn't get the money to move. So, you know, that there's some examples of Gundagai, Clermont, others that have moved, but it's a big decision. But I think we've reached the point where, particularly in places like Lismore, Brisbane, Northern Rivers, there are some people that we really need to think about relocating because they're flooding more frequently and they can't afford insurance anymore. And the cost of rebuilding all the time is just astronomical. So the tipping point, I think, is coming if it hasn't already come.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah, I hope so.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we have any questions from the audience that might prompt further discussion amongst us all. Please do raise your hand and we'll call on you, or you can type your question in the chat if you're either feeling a bit shy or would rather I read it out. Katie Holmes.
Hi, Katie.
Hi. Thank you so much for such a fabulous discussion. It's so exciting to sit here and listen to you. It really is. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. Grace, you mentioned at the very beginning about the naming of that hairpin bend in the Darabin and that it was called the Nick. Is that what it was called?
Nick Point.
Nick Point. Yeah.
I just wanted at least 3 or 4, but it's the main one. Yeah.
The main one.
Yep.
I just wanted to ask you about the naming, and Margaret might have some comments about this as well. You've talked a lot about Aboriginal naming of the river and the recovery of those names. Ruth and I are working, and now Margaret are also working on a project on the Murray-Darling, and we've got a case study around the Barmer Choke. And what
That's a great name.
Yeah, exactly. And what we're looking at is the way in which the Aboriginal name used to mean the Narrows, and that's also a name that local people have called it since at least the 1920s. As the river has become more and more important for irrigation, downstream of that narrowing, it's increasingly become called the Choke, as from about the 70s. And this is something Ruth is probably more versed in than I am. But it's been fascinating for us to think about the way in which that name which has now become the standard term, and it's now seen as this really big problem because it's preventing the movement of water from one part of the river to another effectively for economic purposes. So I'm interested to know whether there's any indication of changes in settler naming of parts of the river and whether they may or may not reflect any different ideas of what the river is for, which is really what the Choke kind of encompasses, that naming of the Choke.
Can't think of any parallel. I mean, that is just very evocative.
Striking.
Isn't it? Yeah, it's very striking. It's a Choke. Yeah, they probably did, but many don't get recorded. So they had very general, like remember, the earliest settlers are ex-convicts, so they're people from, the rural parts of England and Ireland. They use very basic names like down the river. That's the name of one part. That was the original name of Sackville's, down the river. So and they just named places for what happened there. So there's a lot of overlap between ex-convict names and Aboriginal names. So they'll say, this is the Timber Getters Point, or that sort of thing. But with Sackville, so Nick Point is just the term that the flood people use for where the river is held back and causes flooding. Then it was called.
What does it mean? What is Nick Point?
It's just a nick in the river.
Okay.
They often use it. It's just the term that
generic term. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a generic term for any sharp bend that stops water flow and backs up. Yeah. So then it gets called down the river, and then Governor Macquarie comes along and calls it Sackville, to flatter some of his patrons, of course. And then we found on the McGarvey list, its original Darug and probably Darkinjung name is Drumbaloa. Now that's really interesting because there are huge cliffs there, and Drumbaloa means the rainbow moves through. and that's a reference to the great creator eel being also associated with rainbows. And there are a couple of names like this on the list, and also references to river monsters that live in the holes, and they all matched up to holes in the river and cliffs. And so what the names are telling us is a much larger story about the creation story, about, you know, Gurungari and Goria, the river monsters that actually tore up this country trying to escape from the hunter Mirigan, who's a tiger quoll. This is a dreaming story, but the reason it's relevant is because these ancestral beings, giant eels, tearing up country, creating rivers, there's stories like this all over Australia, also a flood bringer. So Durumbaloa refers to floods, and it's located at Sackville, and you can see the great cliffs where the giant eel has carved his way through in his desperate attempt to get away from Mirigan. And I do think that story is also saying it's a warning, right? It's a warning. This is not within human capacity to control. And we do have stories from before the invasion where Aboriginal people talked about a flood that was so big that people who couldn't escape had to climb in the tallest trees, and they were still washed out. And the tallest trees are 40 meters high. So, you know, this is much longer history here. And that place, Sackville, I'm so pleased you brought it up, did tell us a lot about dreaming places and how landscape matches names, and also, you know, links with ancestral beings and dreaming stories.
Thanks, Grace. What a beautiful answer.
Great question, Katie. It hit me as well, the connection there. And we've had a comment in the chat from Daniel Collins that this is referring to some kind of geological discontinuity. So someone perhaps with some geomorphology in their background there.
Right, yeah.
High praise from Marcel as well in the chat, which is lovely too.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the Brisbane River, and some of the Indigenous names have survived that indicate water holes or meeting places and so on, so that helps. The only one that I can think of that is even vaguely close to the Nick is 17 Mile Rocks, which is a whole lot of rocks that were a navigational hazard that the settlers hated. So they had several attempts of trying to blow them up.
That'd be right.
And eventually they blew them up in 1965, and it was stopping the ships going from the Brisbane River up towards the Bremer River. So that's the only thing I can think of that's obviously not the same, but in terms of its restriction on what settlers wanted to do to the river, it's the same sort of thing, because they couldn't get their ships through, and that was how that, before the railway line, how you got stuff from between Brisbane and Ipswich, which was another convict outpost. So that was a point of problem for them.
But even 17 Mile, that's an old school name too.
Yeah.
They're so common that you know that the first people who gave the names before anybody like Macquarie came along to smother them in fancy names, those 2 mile, 3 mile, 4 mile, etc., first ponds, second ponds, third ponds, they're very geographically located. So they assume that you know what it's 17 miles away from.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it makes me think in Perth, obviously where I'm from, a lot of people will know that there's part of the Swan River that's the Narrows. So there's the Narrows Bridge, but again,
Narrows, yeah, there's another one. Oh, we have the Rip, because that's where Broken Bay rips into Brisbane water. Oh. Yes, I don't know what the Aboriginal. We don't have Aboriginal names, unfortunately, though we're working on it.
One of the questions that occurred to me, I suppose. Looking at the flood histories as you have, I wonder whether your, I suppose, protagonists or your key actors are changing in what they're attributing flooding to. Is it sometimes an act of God? Is it sometimes the fault of the dam? Is it sometimes the fault of just, you know, bad luck? I'm sort of interested in how these narratives change, and then we might move on to Stephen's question in the chat.
Sure. Can I take that one first, Grace?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, do.
So in the 1890s flood, which is 1893, they had 2 in a fortnight, and they blamed God. And they definitely blamed God, because they had a day of humiliation that they held in Brisbane to pray. And they decided that the reason the floods had come was because the funding had been withdrawn from Catholic schools. So that was God divine. And then after they had the dam, that changed it, because then it became a failure of science and technology. And then in the 2011 flood, the myth got around that it was the fault of the dam operators. So they blamed them. And then in the last floods, I thought what was going to happen, but it didn't develop to the extent I thought it would. There's a meteorologist, I'll get there, the weathermen, who had misforecast what was going to happen. So they always find a scapegoat, whereas I've always suggested that the scapegoat is the fact that we live on the floodplain. But it's interesting, each flood's brought a different villain, depending on what technology and what stage of history we're at with, in terms of dams particularly.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Margaret. And the way, it changes over time. I think for the early settlers on the Hawkesbury, most of them had a belief in what was called providence. People familiar with that idea? It's just got a disembodied vast power that could save you or could also condemn you. So it's a little bit confusing about, it's not a benevolent God or anything like that. But providence, everybody talked about providence. And as I said, people, you still use the word gamble because they're taking risks, and their whole lives had been risks. They survived an amazing range of, people who went to sea were always at risk of being wrecked, and they couldn't swim. So if your ship goes down, they live on boat. Their boats are how they get around, and they can't swim. They're constantly taking risks. So risk is part of life in a way that I'm not sure that it is now, because people want to assess risks, and there's a whole industry in risk assessment, and take the lead. So it's a fascinating comparison. But luck, providence, and the idea that there is a kind of equilibrium in the river, that you'll get paid back for what you lost, which is why they're quite positive after a flood, which is weird. And the villain, they understood how the river worked too, because quite early they're saying, oh, there's great falls in the distant mountains, which is true, and that's the water can't get away. They knew that from early on, and so the river is the bad guy. Really, they're blaming the river, and they know, but they also know that it brings gifts.
And Stephen's reminded us of the term gambler's fallacy, which indicates that perhaps gambling and risk assessment has continued to sort of be a mindset, at least in some parts of the world.
I'm sure it has.
Relatively more recently. So one of your comments there, Grace, and I must acknowledge Tony has in the chat reminded us of this fabulous phenomenon, not fabulous in necessarily a good way, but really a great name for the something affecting the Barmah Choke, which is this amazing sand slug, which is this accumulation of sand in the system, which is narrowing this area even further. So thanks for that, Tony. But something that you mentioned there, Grace, and I think Margaret can talk to this as well, is something that Claire Brennan's picked up on in the chat. And this is the connection between your rivers and the ocean. And Grace, you reminded us that these people are water people. They've come on ships, they're maritime people, and they're moving into a riverine area. What about the connections between tides and floods and these experiences?
Sure. Before I knew anything about this, I thought the tidal zone was fixed. So I had to be a long learning experience of learning that it changes over time with rainfall and currents and all kinds of things, of course. So that's really important, because it's really important to know where the salt water is at different times. And of course, in drought, there's more salt water, and they all lament that. And then there's this, when there are floods, there's a massive flood flume going out into the ocean. And so there's one account of a ship's captain seeing flood wreckage 300 miles away from the shore, and another one when they're coming into, I think they're probably 100 miles, maybe 50 miles offshore outside Broken Bay, and they see dead pigs floating on haystacks. So, it's not only that the flood affects the banks and takes away everybody's possessions, such as they are, but it takes all that stuff out to the ocean and also dumps it along the shoreline along the way. And this still happens today. People often forage for stuff and start building with it. And you also have names like Pumpkin Point. That's because all the pumpkins ended up there in a flood from one, and it's not predictable. The currents will run this way one time, another way another time, which is why it's important to, when you've got 9 major floods, to do a biography of each of them, because they're all different and they have different lengths of people recovering afterwards. That could take years. So not sure if I answered the question, but yes, of course, those relationships between rivers and oceans are really important.
Yeah, and the early explorers in Queensland saw a big mud plume in Moreton Bay, which is how they started looking for an inland river.
Right, the sign.
Thought,
they knew there was
mud. There's mud. There must be silt.
There must be a river.
Yeah, and so that was a clue. And also, the tide is a factor in the Brisbane River. It goes halfway up the river system, or a certain way up the river system. But in the lots of people think the tide is a really big factor, and it is in smaller floods, because we can get a high tide, which can cause some flooding in low-lying areas of the city every high, full moon.
Sure.
But in the really large floods, it's not a factor, because they just basically wash over the top. Yeah. So they cancel out that tide. But the tide is very much embedded in those myths of the river. So that was something I had to get my head around a lot, because I hadn't really thought about tides much either, because I live in the Bremer, and the Bremer has no tides. So I had to think about how that worked. But yeah, there's that point where it's not part of the story anymore.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Interesting. And all the problems, I guess, of heavy rainfall and marine areas and
that causes an enormous problem. And the debris is phenomenal. The Moreton Bay gets full of rubbish. And there's a lovely story in the 1890s flood where someone from Brisbane first knew that the Brisbane was flooding, because it's before the telegraph lines have washed away. And she knew it was flooding because she found her gates on the shores of Redcliffe Beach. So all sorts of stuff washes down the. We've had cows, we had kangaroos in the 2011 flood. We get all sorts. I mean, that was another reason that we knew the extent of the floods, because where the branded cattle end up, you can follow. Unfortunately, you can follow those flood routes with what washes down. So, yeah.
That's something I hadn't thought of, but
yes, sharing the good news there, really.
Oh dear, we have a question from Harrison Croft.
Hello, yes, Harry, I'm investigating the Birrarung, which is the Yarra River in Melbourne. I'm based at Monash University, and thanks, an incredible talk and very obviously pertinent for me. I was flicking through Margaret's book. I just finished it a couple of weeks ago. I thought, what a perfect opportunity to revisit something you mentioned right in the very, very, very beginning, which is like the anthropocentric term flooding. And I guess I'm quite keen to know how we might come to appreciate the ecological importance of flooding better, because trapping water in dams, or restricting the natural movement of the water, the contracting and the expanding, is can be detrimental for the landscape and the waterscape. And I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the title of my book, which is A River with a City Problem, came up when I was researching, and it was one of those aha moments when I was researching, because it totally flips the way you think about it. Because humans always describe floods as being bad or evil or destructive, but they aren't. They're just a natural cycle, and the river system needs them. They flush out our blue-green algae. They replenish the water supply. They put that beautiful silt on our systems, and they feed the fish. So they're absolutely vital. And the floods don't need humans. They will happen whether humans are there or not. And I think that's really, really important in terms of, as a human, we often just think about the damage caused or the lives lost or the dollars cost, the capitalistic society that we are, that's the framing we give. They're bad. But in fact, they're actually really good for all the reasons that you exactly outlined. And I think that's a really important discussion that is not in my book. And it was something that I thought about a lot more at the beginning. And it was, you make research decisions and writing decisions and didn't go there. But I think that's a story that needs to be told about rivers a lot, about how floods are really, really vital to the ecology of these places, and that's really overlooked in planning. It's really overlooked in strategies about managing rivers in terms of water supply or sewerage or whatever, but it's really vital. So please do your work, and I look forward to reading what you write. It'd be great.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great question. Thanks, Harry. It sort of comes to one of those questions we often hear about with disaster studies. Would it be a disaster if there weren't humans there? If a tree falls in the woods?
Exactly. It's a classic tree falls in the woods thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh no, really interesting. Well, I'm glad to hear some more work being done on these questions. It's very interesting stuff indeed. So,
and it's a rich area too, because there's a lot of people doing fish work and mangroves and all sorts of things, but they haven't been put together particularly with floods. So I think it's a very rich seam to be exploring in the future. So great work.
Yeah. And also one that's not necessarily constrained to urban areas or suburban areas. We talk about floodplain harvesting and these sorts of questions as well, and sort of the kind of assumptions we have about how land and water should be separated and constant and all these kinds of things. Taylor has a question. He's coming in the nick of time, or a prompt, he says, to consider the recent shifts in river governance, the movement towards legal personhood, which offers agency to the river in some ways, often represented by Indigenous peoples. This might present, an opportunity for rethinking who or what is at fault with floods. Precedents with the Wanganui River in Aotearoa or Birrarung Yarra in Melbourne, for example. Could this kind of democratisation, for want of a better term, of rivers be one way or a possible future for histories of rivers?
Well, possibly. I'm fascinated by this personhood of rivers, and I don't know enough about it. I don't know how legally it would work, but what an amazing thing to think about. And certainly after what Margaret's just said, I mean, they do need to flood. They need their freshers as well. Remember the 37 freshers and floods in 25 years. But I don't know. I mean, how do we get around?
Sorry. Well, you've mentioned that. Can you explain freshers?
A fresh is a small flood.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I know. My editor tried to chuck it out of the book and I refused, because that was the term that was used. I don't think we use it anymore, but it's
still used.
It's still used. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Because it's not.
It's a lovely term.
So we only talk about the big floods when they negatively destroy everything, which they do. But there's also freshers, and they do all that same work as well, and they're really important. And of course, all the weirs on the Nepean have really changed that system, and changed the kinds of fish, because the water's colder and all kinds. It just has massive impact, just as you said, Margaret. But what an interesting question about how that might affect the way we write river histories. I'm just not sure how giving the river its own rights as a legal entity, what do you do with all the people that have property on rivers that you've been talking about, Margaret? Real estate agents and insurance companies, and there's a whole massive human system propping up what is there now.
But Taylor is right, because the rights of the river is slightly embedded in dam management in Brisbane, in that there actually is an environmental flow factor as well. So as well as the water they save for water supply, they do actually release water, and they are freshers, and they are releases that are returning water to the system. Now, I mean, we know with Murray-Darling issues about how much water is allocated to the environment, but if you start thinking about the rights of the river, then that might change water allocation policy, that the river itself gets more water. And that's probably what's at the heart of that Murray-Darling, or how we manage rivers, is a recognition that rivers themselves need water. We think of that, well, lots of people frame it as that water that goes into the rivers is wasted.
No.
And you talk about wasted water all the time, whereas it's actually not wasted. It's just going into the river system where it's meant to go. So I think if you do I've read a little bit about the New Zealand right to the river legislation and so on, but I'm not quite sure about its Australian application. But I think it is at the heart of maybe how we manage water in the future, that we have to recognise that the environment needs more than the 1 or 2% that it's currently allocated.
Yeah.
If it gets it at all.
If it gets it at all, yeah.
And don't forget the perennial, let's turn the rivers around and water the inland.
Oh,
yeah.
gosh.
Every election it comes back.
Every time.
Yes, next. Well, I suppose we've had La Nina for the past couple of years, so we haven't had that reprised, and maybe with the new government we won't hear that.
Oh, we got it in the last election, the Hell's Gate. It's alive and well. Ask our Townsville colleagues amongst us. It's alive and well.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh dear. And it seems like there's another continued discussion on the personhood of rivers and what that might mean.
Fascinating.
Alive and well, says Claire, spokeswoman.
Yes.
Yes,
unfortunately.
I'm really sort of interested in how we sort of, I suppose, think about the future, I guess, when we're thinking about history. And often I think when we say we're historians and we talk to people out in the world, and there's an expectation there might be lessons in history, or that whether they're prescriptive or not, or what history can tell us. And I'm wondering whether in the sort of broader patterns that you're identifying, or in the kinds of the conversations you've had over the years of doing this research, whether you've got any more clarity on what historians might have to offer when we are talking about the future when it comes to flooding and the management of our rivers.
Margaret, go.
Okay. One of the things that people don't understand is the cycles of floods. Grace mentioned earlier that no two floods are the same, and I think that's what history can show. That I think people think, oh, I didn't flood in 2011, so I won't flood in 2022. Well, that's just rubbish. As I said, there's 22 creeks in the Brisbane system, so it just needs one of those creeks to behave differently, and you're looking at a very different flood. So I think one thing we can do is educate people about how history shows that floods can always behave differently. And that's important, and that they can come in clusters. We know that from history, we know that from the science, but also, you don't have to wait 100 years for the 100-year flood. It can come in a fortnight. So I think one of the things we can do is start dispelling some of those myths. And I think that's what history can do, because myths are strong, but the lessons you can learn is the mistakes we've made, and maybe not keep repeating them. Like, we keep building in the same places, and I keep saying, why? And it's just hitting your head against the same brick wall. So I think history can inform decision-making. It can inform some bad decisions we've made. And it can actually identify some good things we've done. Like, we have moved some places. We have done some building code reform. We actually introduced a town plan with some flood instructions, So history can show those moments where change is possible, and it can identify opportunities for adaptation or change. It's whether we take them or not is the next question. But what I tried to show in my research is that we have had moments where alternative paths could have been taken, and floods are an obvious one. There's that little window after a flood where you can talk about moving Lismore, and then suddenly that opportunity's gone. But I think one of the things that our work can do is maybe keep those conversations going a little bit longer, or maybe get it to the policy table, but that's hard. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, and also just knowing the differences in floods. They don't behave the same, but they will come back, as you say, and they do occur in clusters. And this ridiculous 1 in 100 year, journos use and politicians use it all the time. They have no idea what it means. And it doesn't mean it's going to come in another 100 years. It can come, as you say, next week. So,
and it should go.
1806, there were three floods in 1806, 2 of them monster floods, and we've just seen that in the Northern Rivers as well.
Absolutely.
So more floods. I mean, I also want to come back to that sort of historical sense of place, and people understanding their place better. And as I said, there is a hunger for that. I do think people will hopefully take action and care more about their own places, if they have a better understanding of a deeper understanding of not only its rhythms, but its history, its deep time history with the Aboriginal people, the stories that belong to country, and the respect that you give to people's experience, you know. So the taking ordinary people's experience seriously is important as well, you know. So it's not all about well, so much of history that I learned was about white men, basically, only ones with money. So such a little peephole history. So we've got to open history right out so people think, I'm part of that and I'm part of this place.
And the rivers have a history. I don't think
the rivers have a history. The mountains have a history. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things in Brisbane is it's just sort of seen as this benign landscape feature that's just there, that offers great real estate or
lies there. Yeah, I know.
Run a city cat or something useful. But, you know, and then every so often it roars and creates a flood and sort of, oh, gosh, who knew? But they have their own history, and the history is not just on the land, and it's not just the right white rich men. And the river would have its history if those people disappeared. And I think that's really important, that we need to write that into the history as well. So it's not just the backdrop, but it's
no, that's right.
Yeah.
Well,
we actually call ourselves a river city, but it cracks me up because it's the last thing we actually think about. You know, I think, wow, how do you name something but not actually give that a big priority?
Well, I think that's true in Sydney too, the harbour city. I mean, mostly that's about real estate and having a view. And I can't complain because I have a lovely view of Brisbane water and I love it, but don't want to be hypocritical. But yeah, it's almost like having a picture on the wall. It's just a window looking out onto the harbour. And it's got so many issues that people don't care about.
Yeah.
But not anymore, Grace, because they're going to read more river histories. And
they're going to read more river histories. Well, I just want to say how many excellent river histories there are now. And I mean, we've got Emily's work and your work, Margaret, and we've got Ian Tyrrell on Cook's River. So maybe we're at a turning point, because until now, even though they're people magnets and have been important since, well, at least 65,000 years ago, as well as in their own right, you know, they haven't really had much attention in history. Environmental history that's making a difference there.
And Ruth's work on waterways as well. So the western part of the country. So, you know, we're getting more and more.
I haven't named them all the people.
No.
More. And I do think we may be at a turning point. It's about time.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's lots more to do. And there are more
good too. Thank you, Amanda. Now I feel terrible for leaving Heather out.
We'll tell Heather. No, I think, you know, you both made amazing cases for the specificity of our river histories, that we cannot generalize, that floods, even between floods, there are great differences, let alone the ways in which different rivers function and the histories that we can learn there. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Grace Karskens and Margaret Cook, for walking us through your rivers and for sharing your amazing insights from your research. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's turned out to join us this evening or today, wherever you might be, and for the really stimulating questions that you've provided as well. So for those of you on the East Coast, like us, of Australia, that is, I hope you're rugged up and keeping warm. Maybe not so much you, Claire, you might stay in a T-shirt. But thank you so much for a wonderful session. And of course, we have been recording this, and hopefully it will be up in the YouTube universe sometime very soon. And I'd also like to thank Rowan Howard for providing tech support and for running the show behind the scenes. Really appreciate your support. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you.
Thank you very much for your moderation, Ruth. It was
thank you, Ruth, for organising.
Thank you very much.
You made it work this time. Thanks, guys, and good night.
All right.
Bye.